Welcome to the Parable Arrows podcast, where we wrestle with story to seek deeper truth. We believe that engaging with the art of the world can help us discern more of what God, as the true artist, is trying to reveal in the beauty of his story. Join us as we discuss movies, ideas, and practice engaging with art, God's word, our thoughts, and each other.
Hey Archers, welcome back to another episode of the Parable Arrows podcast. On this episode, I'm very excited to be talking about the 1975 film Rollerball. So this is not the Rollerball of the early 2000s. I think it was like 2008, 2010. This is the OG Rollerball with practical effects and everything. So we're going to be talking about this movie because I happened to watch it having read an IGN, which is a gaming website. I read an article about it. And I saw the premise, and they were talking about some weird scenes about shooting trees with a laser gun, and I was like, this sounds awesome. So I decided to watch it. I loved it. It's now in my top 5. Femi does not share that take, so I'm really excited to kind of like see where we maybe differ a little bit on our taste, but also how we both were still able to pull out some messages. And with that, we're going to use our usual SMART outline to break down this story. So that stands for summary, message, audience, rethink, and a touch of theology at the end. So let's get into it. All right, so Rollerball is a very interesting setting. We have a future where corporations run the world. There are no more countries. And instead of wars, we have this very violent sport called Rollerball, which is basically a mix of roller derby with, motorcycles and spike gloves and all sorts of stuff. It's a very violent game, and there is a player, Jonathan E., who has been the top player in Rollerball for a long time, to the point that he is kind of becoming the face of the sport. You could think of the Steph Curry of the NBA or, the Tom Brady of the NFL, stuff like that. So he is then approached after a major win by a corporate executive named Mr. Bartholomew. And this corporate leader basically puts it in Jonathan's head that there are people in the corporate leadership that want him to retire. Well, Jonathan doesn't like this idea because he feels like he was built for Rollerball. He's the best player there's ever been. There's no one better than him. Why would they ask him to do this? And so this request by Mr. Bartholomew kind of gets him thinking, like, what's going on? Like, why would they ask me to do this? So he starts kind of pressing into some friends and some family and realizes that there's something else going on, but he doesn't really ever find out the details, which the movie doesn't focus a ton on. So we see at a event with a bunch of fancy, rich people where Jonathan is watching a highlight video that was supposed to be his retirement party, but he declined, making the elites very unhappy with him. He gets a talking to from Mr. Bartholomew, and we find out in the next match the rules are changing. So with Rollerball, the rules change from match to match. So now the Rollerball game is going to be more violent. So there are limited substitutions and no fouls, which means if people get punched out or die, so be it. So we go through this game. Jonathan survives, and we move into the final game where Jonathan is kind of anticipating playing his last match as the rules change again. So now there are no substitutions and there are no penalties, meaning if basically the last team standing is standing. So it's the most violent rule set in Rollerball. So Jonathan plays through the game. He nearly dies. At this point in the movie, he's lost his friend Moonpie to a previous match, and he has a chance to kind of let out some anger where it is him and one other player on the other team left, and he has the ball to score, and he's ready to punch the guy in the face and kill him, and he'd be the last player on the court. But instead, he lets the guy go, and he skates over to the goal, and he scores, and he wins the game for them. And so the movie ends with a freeze frame of the fans shouting Jonathan's name louder and louder and louder, and our kind of sleazy corporate guy, Mr. Bartholomew, is seen sneaking away. All right, so now we're going to jump into the message. So that summary is kind of vague. This is a very art housey almost movie for those of you who are interested in watching it. If you are like a film nerd, you will probably really enjoy it. If you are not a big fan of like 1960s to like 1990s film, this probably won't be your jam, but that's okay. So Femi, I kind of want to hear a little bit about that from you. So what about this movie? Because you had texted me that this wasn't quite your cup of tea, but you did still pull some messages out of it. So what were some of the things that you were doing watching this movie and it not being maybe your favorite, but still like being engaged with it? And how did you pull out some of those details?
Yeah. So a couple things when I watch a movie and what I suggest to other people when they're watching a movie is to remember like the context of the movie, the film, the time, etc. So this is a movie set in the future from 1975. So 1975 visuals about the future, 1975 aspects, aesthetics, timing, pacing, camera angles, shots, like acting, etc. I grew up through the 90s and early 2000s watching faster paced, different camera shot, different type of action sequences, more fast cuts, less film, more digital. And so just my proclivities of what I like and my affinities for what I like have changed when I'm looking at a film. So in this film, the two big things that I think really people have to be aware of is the banter and the dialogue back and forth between the characters is very different from modern day. How people speak, what people speak, the overtness of their behavior, their facial expressions, etc., is very different from more modern films. The subtlety is super subtle. It's not subtlety on purpose where there's a close up and a zoom in where you can see everything in the character's face. And then the pacing between scenes is different. There's a lot more setting shots where you see a house or a building or the structure or the office place where today that's not a financial incentive for you to put into a film. So all that being said, what I was looking at was what is the story that the people who are using this setting, using these characters, using this pacing, trying to tell. So the message of the movie that I got was more around the corporations versus Jonathan of what their fear was and what Jonathan was trying to do. The masses, all of the people who were being overrun by these corporations had more power than they thought. But pleasure is a great pacifier. Rollerball being a violent sport, a sport where you can have a team that represents you in your area. It pacifies you. It makes you feel like, yeah, this is my sort of my outlet. And if I can get into your outlets, it makes you feel better. If I can get you to enjoy a thing that I create and I can then make money off of the thing that I create that keeps you sort of where you need to be, I can do off and go off and do other things on the side. If people got into the rooms where the value was actually being created, they'd see there's another side to the consumption and the corruption and perverse incentives people have in making other people less valuable and more consumers. And Jonathan's character was messing up that system for the corporations in this film. And you see him try to figure out what is a solution through the film. I probably would have picked a different solution than just keep playing.
Yeah.
If people are dying. Yeah. But that idea was the thing that I had to sort of separate when I'm watching. And again, just encouraging listeners, you do not have to watch it something you do not like, you actively don't like. 100%. But being curious is one of the huge tenets of what we believe in. Being curious with your scripture reading, being curious with your consumption habits, and then being curious with the things you're consuming. And so with this movie, put away like 2020's pacing, 2020's dialogue, writing style, etc. That's all informed by this stuff. Even put on early 2000s the remake that's informed, because that one's very dated as well. Yeah. I watched that one as well.
Yeah.
Very dated. But it's still a conflict that you have to wrestle with of the masses having all this control but not using it because they're pacified or they're not seeing the system for what it is, and the people at the top are okay wasting time, even their own pleasure, in maintaining the system as is. and certain people who would break people into recognizing how much they have power as individuals would be dangerous. So that's what I thought the message of the movie was, is be aware of the systems you're in and how they're trying to control. It still sort of has a very American ideal to it too, of one individual can break down an entire system just by force of will. I'm like, like in real life, the same film would have him usually be killed, and then a news story of, oh, he died in a car accident. We're so sad. Let us all treasure him and the thing that he appreciated most, rollerball. Like, and just like keep moving on, right? Yeah. But in this movie, gotta have like the main hero, single Western-ish style. Like, I can rise through all the corruption. So that was the main message of the movie. How about you? Since you liked the movie, what are some of the things you were looking at that you liked? And again, what your message of the movie was that you thought?
Yeah. So for me, I think what I liked so much about it is, one, I'm a big fan of like dystopian kind of theoretical, what if we were in this scenario and what if we had these kind of elements guiding our world, but we still had very similar desires, you know? So like a lot of these people, it's like it's like sports fans, but it's this very violent, brutal, you know, death can happen very easily sport, and everyone's just kind of like, yep, this is how it is now. And so that buy-in is interesting, but specifically from a character perspective, and one of the messages I took away is, to me, and I have it as a verse in our theology section, but I feel like the movie in a primarily secular way is kind of a like dip your toes into the idea of what it means to renew your mind and to kind of like wake up, to like be in a system or to be in something, and to have a moment where something happens where you kind of like shake your head a bunch and you look around and you're like, whoa, hold on. This is not at all what I thought this was. And then the further you start pressing on those spots that seem like that held up before, but it doesn't anymore. And the more they poke, you know, so Jonathan going to the library and the librarian and this is the subtlety of the movie that I like too. There's a scene where Jonathan goes to a library after kind of hearing about, you know, you're supposed to retire. And he's like, who told you that? Or like, why do I have to do that? So he's like going to the library, like, oh, I'll just go dig into this a little bit. And the librarian's like, oh, well, we don't have the actual original text, but we have the summarized corporate version. And he's like, so what you're telling me is you have the version that you want me to read. And she's like, well, I mean, it's like, it's just as good. It's like the same. And so you can tell he's like, so you're controlling the narrative. Like, you're controlling what I know. And so that starts to, and so then there's other things in his life that he starts pressing on. And he's like, that's why they're doing that. That's why they're doing that. And it feeds kind of this like, this whole thing is rigged and it's broken, and it kind of, you know, but like you said, there's something to be challenged and continuing to play the sport anyway. But that was one of the things I liked, is I think, you know, especially in our modern movie, dystopian movies, I feel like it's not as common to have a hero, as cheesy in 1970s as it is, it's not common to have a hero actually like do something noble and then live through all of that. You know, like he doesn't become a casualty of the system in a way. And so I like that idea of him waking up and still kind of like pressing through and doing all that stuff. But so speaking to that, what were some of the parts of the message that you maybe agreed, didn't agree with, Femi? Like, where do you stand on either of these messages from us?
Yeah, the thing that I believe is always going to be true is we live in societies where there's money to be made off of figuring out how people think and what they're going to buy and how you can get in the system, is there's always some type of active pacification that happens. So in the movie, it is pleasure in various forms, whether it's violence, drugs, sex, and depending on how high you are up in the corporate structure, you get more benefits or less benefits based off of how you keep your mouth shut, what you say, what you do, and that makes people, you know, docile. You know, you don't want to have too many people be raising their hands saying, hey, something's weird about this. So if I can get you all to look at your phones too much, or get you all to watch Netflix and stay home, I don't have to deal with a bunch of different backlash. And so that's the thing that I agree with. But the producers agree to this venture until it becomes an expectation. So the people who are making money off of things like Rollerball and drugs and sex and all this other stuff, they've now expected the benefit. And the problem then becomes the expectation by all these corporate raiders that this is the system that will be the system forever. It starts to challenge their own sensibilities because now they're trying to maintain a structure. They're building a structure and then they're trying to maintain it. The most pure version of getting away from the system is like the ice bucket challenge or simple trends that like pop up and then die, pop up and then die. An influencer who pops up really quickly and then dies, because then I don't have to change the structure of the system, but I get more people onto my platform and more people buying the thing and more people blah, 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 blah. Right. That's great. If somebody really gets famous, you can watch Black Mirror season 1, episode 2, and you'll see sort of this weird conflagration featuring Daniel Kaluuya. And when someone starts to fight the system, you have to figure out, oh man, what do we do to make sure they're not fighting the system in a way we don't want them to? And that is hard. And now I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I maintain this person? So going a little bit further into that, in music, it's how do I keep someone who's going to continue to pump out, hit after hit after hit for me to make money off of them? It's very rare to see a Beyonce or a Taylor Swift because that's hard. Mm-hmm. There are many, many good storytellers, singers, songwriters who have to deal with a lot less money because they've found their core audience and that's what they're just being okay with. It's hard for that person to also become the pinnacle of Beyonce, Taylor Swift level of fame because that's part of a machine in itself and sustaining an expectation and a persona and all this other stuff. So you have to agree to the venture and then be aware of the expectation you're building to maintain this passive audience you're working with. So I think that's the part where I'm like, I don't think people really have that sort of sustaining power to do so. I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
And that's the part where I'm like, that's hard. It's really hard to catch fire in a pan and hold it from like Jonathan was able to in the film. It's really hard to do that and maintain it for so long, especially in a sport like rollerball where your body just sort of breaks down. You don't have to really force somebody to retire. They just get hurt. So those are things that I was like, oh, let's think about this from the producer side, the venture side, the artist side. That might have been a jumbled mess to an audio listener. And maybe even to you, Josh.
No, I think I'm tracking. I think
is the thing that I was thinking of, like, oh man, that's unique.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. And I'll maybe connect kind of both of our messages because I think that's kind of part of what I was drawn to in the movie is I think there's a really interesting question of like, if you're in a system that you know has components of it that really need to be changed because they're objectively not healthy for human flourishing, you could even take that, from a secular level system. Why can't I think of the word? It's 9:30. My brain just farted so bad. But you have like systematic injustice and stuff like that, where it's like, there's that. But then you could even say, even from a biblical perspective, you go to, I mentioned Bonhoeffer down below, where it's like you have literal ideologies that are running nations and influencing things. And at some point, a really uncomfortable, difficult question to ask is, how much can I change? And is it actually a really high amount that I could change, but is the cost equally as high? And I think that part of the movie was really fascinating to me because I think there's a point where, like, at the very end when Jonathan's going out to his last match, he's standing in that red hallway and it's just him and it's silent and it's quiet and you just hear his skates. And for me, I was thinking like, I personally interpreted that as like, okay, he's ready to die. Like, he's like, I don't care. Like, I stood for what I thought was the right decision, which is not letting them force me out of this game. And so like, here I go. And if I die, I die. And so, so I think from that like pacification side, like I often really, I like how you framed it actually, where there's this tension we're in, which is how much can I actually as a consumer change everything, because I feel like that's something that drives me kind of crazy when people are like, well, if you just like eat organic, like that goes to all the farms. I'm like, yeah, but like how many people does the money change hands through? And like, where does all this stuff go? Like that probably doesn't actually do anything, like that kind of idea. But then there's other things where I'm like, well, I could spend $20 at Target to buy this gift for my mom for her birthday, or I could spend this $20 at a smaller shop nearby that has this something similar, or even maybe like more unique,
or even
and
$40,
cool. Or even $40, like whatever. And so I think there's a reality that we as people in a world that just is, for as long as we will understand it, run by corporations and businesses and governments and all this stuff. Like we are in a tension. We're like, okay, how much can I really change? And am I maybe stressing myself out too much with thinking there's more than I can change that I actually can't? To call back from an earlier episode, you gave the analogy of trying to hit a fastball with a pool noodle, where it's like, you just, at some point, like you're aiming for something you're never going to hit, like, make it a little bit easier to do that. But no, I would agree. Like, I think there's a lot of invitation in this question or in this film to, what do we do? What do we do when we kind of need cell phones? We kind of need computers. We kind of need cars. We kind of need all this stuff. And yeah, maybe ideally, like we would live in a world where that wasn't true, but what are we willing to do to either change that, or how much do we need to, kind of acquiesce in a healthy way to be like, well, at some point I have to kind of get on board to a degree within reason, of like healthy moral standards. So, all right, we could probably sit here forever. So I'll move us along and we'll jump into our audience and our rethink. So Femi, I feel like this one's pretty straightforward. I'll actually let you take this away. So what do you think for our three usual categories? Families with kids being one, friends, and then third, evangelistically to spark conversations. What do you think about all those three categories for us?
As a person with two toddlers, I would say no. You should not watch this movie with kids. Now, obviously, as your kids get older and they're young adulthood, it's very philosophical. And if your kid's like an art house film junkie or is starting to look like that, like, it's your kid.
Right.
But it's violent, it's slower, it's a little confusing. The language is not clear. It seems like it's not real. And there are some innuendos and implications that are just not really healthy for true kids. So probably not. With friends, if they have an appetite, again, it is more of an art housey film, very mid-century modern, like design, aesthetic.
Super 70s. Like
super 70s.
Super 70s.
Yeah. This is supposed to be future, and like the future with fashion of the 1970s is very interesting to look back and watch. And the pacing, again, it's not for everyone, especially if they like how fast things have gotten. Quick aside, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is much slower than modern cartoons and children's content on purpose. And if you see the rise of like really quick, really fast dopamine hits, that show is so slow comparatively to other children's content. And I think we're still trying to figure out as a society, in the West at least, what is accurate speed for children's content and pacing for children's content. But it's the same for adults. Like if you're just scroll to sit down and watch and actually assess a scene, not everybody wants to do that. They get to the next, rollerball scene. So that's just be careful with your friends, know your friends. You should know your friends, right? You like them. And then evangelistically, I would actually not probably pick this film evangelistically because there's so many thoughts geared towards getting someone's ideas on corporations or freedom, but not salvation or like a redemptive piece or self-correction in the storyline. Jonathan never really has to correct himself. He just sort of discovers a negative thing working against him and seemingly prevails. It misses what an order actually should be, what a healthy order is. And so there's no picture really of beauty from the mess. It's just surviving through the mess, a lot from his specific perspective. And even if you thought that corporations were good, for them, it is how easily their structure falls. And so it's more of a clear fighting against evil powers, but doesn't give a view clear of redemption or revelation. So I might pull back because we could get into, as Josh and I could get into, the weeds very, very heavily. So there are things that are not as clean of a story arc or as helpful as a place to dive into where there's clarity provided by the artists who made the movie, who wrote the story and the short story that it's based off of. It's more of the concepts And those can be things that are just in general conversation harder to navigate, like where the conversation is going to sit. Someone can take it and go where they want with it in a way where it might not be fruitful for that evangelistic conversation. It could just get into politics and corporations for a really, really, really long time. So if you want to talk about that with your friends, go ahead, do it. But specifically to try to pivot to the gospel in some type of fashion, it might just be in a series of movies you watch with your friends.
Yeah, definitely.
And not like a one-off sort of convo, late night convo. So what about you, Josh?
Yeah, I would agree. I would maybe, because looking at this, I think you gave really good reasons, and I love the nuance you gave, Femi, for evangelistically, that it's not about restoring the mess, it's surviving the mess. And I feel like, to me, that's kind of the difference between maybe like a quote unquote Christian story or not, is there's a little bit something that's kind of like, can we do something with this? Like, yes, this is all very objectively really bad, but like, how do we address this in a healthy way? So I think that was a good clarification. I would say this is probably the movie for someone who is like, really, they've just had it with modern movies and they want to go back, and they're just like, you know what? Let's just make a hard pivot and just check out something old school and just see what it was like back in the day, and, you know, just like watch something kind of more interesting and creative and artsy. And so I would agree, though, that I think evangelistically, it's probably, for me personally, the strongest. I would maybe recommend that the most out of any of the categories, because at least with like friends, you know, like I have a lot of friends who I know they would not like this movie. Like it would not be their jam. But I could see, especially like I was just talking to my tattoo artist today because I was getting some ink. He and I were talking about business and like art, and like where does like business and art and creativity intersect. And so I didn't get a chance to bring up Rollerball, but that was kind of kicking around in my mind. I was like, oh, this is a very like discussion that fits within that. So I think that's the category that would probably fit in the most of the three. But yeah, to Femi's point, there's a lot of different lanes that are all seemingly very disconnected, and it would take a lot of work and discussion to kind of like really comb through that. And if you want to do that, hey man, go for it. That would be awesome. But also, it's a old school movie.
If I may add, I would also say it's a very empathetic movie. So if you know somebody who's really struggling with feeling like the systems around them are broken, and everything is going to heck in a handbasket, and they don't know how to fight it, and they don't know what to do, it could be empathetic for them to be able to hear more of what's going on emotionally, internally, and that turmoil. And that could be good to hear it and understand, oh, this person has pitted themselves against like the rest of the world. And so they're framing everything like Jonathan did in the film. And so that could be good because, again, movies are still great to help with people connecting or giving word and voice and language to all of the things that are harder to describe off the cuff by having a reference point. And Jonathan feeling isolated, misunderstood, mistrusting, somewhat paranoid, in a dangerous position, still trying to fight, still trying to push, still having some success, could probably describe a whole lot of people in a way that they wouldn't describe themselves. Just a lot of those people wouldn't have this movie as a reference to go to. If you have a friend who's willing to watch it for that, where you can talk to them after and they share that with you, that'd be also really beautiful as a way to hear them and give them some reference points of how stuck they feel, and let you know that let them know that you care for them.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we're going to start diving into our rethinks. So this is where we start asking some more critical, below the surface questions about the movie. So the one I actually want to start with is kind of what you were just saying, Femi. So this could be a good movie to help give language to someone who feels like the systems around them are broken. So what, in your mind, especially thinking in our modern context, where I feel like that's a really big kind of buzzword phrase, is like systems and like tearing things down. What do you think it takes to actually rise or fix a broken system? And then in this movie, it's a lot about like customers versus a product. How do you think customers play a role in that overall process?
Yeah, I think that to go back to the pool noodle and fastball analogy, people sometimes don't assess the problem in a really separated and, to be honest, semantic way to understand what is their actual role in it. So let's using a modern day example. There are a lot of older men who could quit their jobs and get into politics, but none of them quit their job and get into politics until they're sort of done with their career, or they want to complain about young people not understanding politics, and they have a lot of emotions about it. But while they're working, they don't want to run. They don't want to take lesser salaries or work with people they disagree with or anything like that. They just want to keep on going to, for those of us who live in Wisconsin, Packers games or Bucks games, and, doing the things that they do. And the sacrifice that's needed to make a change is the thing that needs to be assessed if you are going to rise in a broken system. The sacrifice, I'm asked like a teacher, the sacrifice that's needed to make a change is the thing that needs to be assessed if you're going to rise in a broken system. I don't know if Jonathan was thinking about all the other players, his team and others, who are going to die or be hurt from his decision to continue to participate.
Yeah.
And it seemingly didn't factor in a whole lot to him, even with the hurting and the injury to Moonpie. He continued to progress. And I think that that's something that, to our audience, like, if you want to change the American political system, you're going to have to understand a lot about psychology, learn a lot about politics, learn a lot about states, their top producing things, the biases, the priorities of different people. And you're going to have to figure out how to thread a needle that nobody wants to thread right now if you're going to rise in the broken system of American two-party politics. If you're going to try to figure out how Russia and North Korea and other countries that people have issues with can change, you're going to have to become a student. And that's going to take time away from friends, families, movies, fun, etc. So what it takes is sacrifice. What a lot of people don't do is think about what that sacrifice means. People can tell you to buy all organic and do all this organic stuff, and that'll help change the system. But really, we're sometimes fitting into a mass market system where they're like, hey, we're trying to make this shift anyway. It's more money for us. And you think you made a change, but really it's just commercially advantageous for people to change to what you want. And being able to assess that is really important. When you have your product, let's say you make screws, literally in every house that's built with wood, because that's how you put wood together. You screw stuff and you nail stuff. It doesn't matter if people like you or not. If they want to live somewhere, it's going to have your product in it. Right? When you get so big. So thinking about that, that's one way. The other way, which is more heartfelt, a little ishigashi and not as sacrificial, is if you're close to the people who have the power to change. One of the things that really changed American politics when it came to different civil rights fights is if you're a white family in the 1970s, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a black family member just pop up. Right? And so it took a long time of a lot of people rubbing shoulders forever to get black-white relations in the United States to where they are currently today. But if you are in the LGBTQ plus community, you pop up in people's families all the time, randomly, right? And when your dad is a political person of power, when your mom is a teacher in power, and you emotionally just pull at their heartstrings, they have to they change faster. So we've seen as that's become more of a vocal thing since the 50s, 60s, and 70s, although that population, the LGBTQ plus population, has been with the world for a long time. We see a lot faster change in that regard for people fighting for different rights and using other historical civil rights fights for rights, etc. So if you can get close to a person who's in power, that's the other way. If you can tug on their heartstrings, that could change a broken system without you having to become a student of everything for a decade. It's really, really hard to do so. The beauty of sports is that you can rise really fast without being a student and pull on people's heartstrings because they are a fan of you in both of those scenarios, which is what happens. And I think the historical one that sticks up the most is the Springboks in South Africa, when Mandela got out of prison, became president, and used the national team to try to catapult this unification of the country. Because he knew it'd be really hard if he tried to change everybody's mind through historical analysis and psychology. But he could get everybody to become a fan of their team and do that together. And it did a lot of work. It helped a lot for them to have something to unify over. But that's a long-winded answer because those two paths take a lot. There's probably some other paths that somebody else could figure out. What about you? What do you think about what it takes to rise?
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on something you said because I think it's the most important. And I think it is bringing me back to the thought of like how Christ in his presence in his life was kind of living out the example of how do you do this? Like, how do you rise in a broken system? And so that idea of what you said is you're like, what do you actually have to give up? And I mean, you know, in the Christian story, it's like, oh, you have to die to yourself. Like, yeah, we know, like, we know that's the phrase, but what does that mean? You know, if like you said, if I want to rise into politics and like, you know, that's like the buzzword right now because we're in 2024 election season, you know, and the buzz phrase is like, bring everyone together. Like, we want unity. It's like, okay, but like, how are you going to do that? You know, like that's cool to say. And I think everybody wants that. But what are you willing to sacrifice to make that happen? What policies are you willing to give up and not pass that will probably make some people who are fans of yours not fans of you anymore in order to bring maybe some fans from the other side in? What are you like? It all gets very like, it's not actually as much about what you bring that's important, but it's about what do you have to let go of in order to do maybe what you need to do. And I mean, I say that as myself too, like, this has been my first year stepping into the school year with teaching where I've really understood to be the most present and healthy and impactful version of myself. There are things in other parts of my life I have to let go of, none of which are bad, but I just have to let go of them or I have to push them back like way, way, way far in the priority list to the point where I almost can't see them. And that's okay. But if I want to impact and change systems and influence education, I have to let go of something. I have to sacrifice something or else I'm going to go crazy.
Right.
So second question is similar to that, like changing the system and, you know, appetites and all that stuff. America loves our sports. We've got like however many professional sports leagues and, you know, it's the favorite thing. Do you think this is a true statement? And then I'll have a question after this. Do you think it's true that sports and athletics have become an idol in American culture? And then how do we know, or what would be some identifiers you would be looking for of other things like sports that would be like quote unquote idols in our modern culture?
Yeah. I knew this question in prep was coming and I still didn't come up with like a bullet list of answers. So I'm going to try to think an answer. First of all, yes, sports for many people, not all, but for many people is an idol. On how do you recognize it? I think there's the individual aspect and then the corporate aspect. On the individual aspect, there's a couple of just heart checks. Does it take up in time the right amount of proportion to your life? So if you know way more about the trade rosters of your teams than what's going on under your roof, that's probably a problem. If you know the emotions of like 4 or 5 of the players and what's going on in their personal lives and their families, but you can't tell me what's going on with your son or daughter and what they're really dealing with, then I'm like, yeah, that's probably an idol. So the proportion is one thing. 2, like what are your emotional triggers? What triggers you emotionally and how do you recover? If someone criticizes your team, does it sit with you for a really long time? Or if they lose, is Monday okay? Or do you have to wait until Tuesday or Saturday they lose? Are you okay on Saturday, like 20 minutes afterwards to go hang out with friends? Or are you just like, yeah, they shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have made that play. The stories of sports are great. And the stories can stick with us without emotionally affecting us. So your emotional triggers would be the second one I think of. The third one, which I don't think people really want to do, is like, it's a proportion of time, your emotional triggers, your money, and how much money is spent on them. Corporately, I think we can just think of like percentage of GDP getting out of whack.
Yeah.
And with sports gambling, sports betting, and the billions of dollars in sporting arenas, I think we can say that there's probably a little bit of an issue with how much, as skilled as those people are and how much work they put in to give us the amazing visual feats that we see, that we probably have something in our humanity a little out of whack based off of the way the dollar proportion is spent. It is a huge bag of worms that I'm not going to try to unravel now.
Yeah.
But corporately, there are many other signals that are similar to those individual ones that we could check off, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
How about you?
No, I definitely agree. One of Gloria's uncles, who isn't a Christian, but is the head of like a spiritual and religious institute. So he and I have a lot of like deep religious and philosophical conversations. And he and I actually talk about sports a lot, and he'll like make fun because our Gloria's family is very like show up on Thanksgiving. There's like 3 football games going on. At least like half the family members are wearing some kinds of Illinois sports paraphernalia. and he's like, this is dumb. Like, why do we care about this? And it's interesting because for me, like, I love basketball. I just played soccer with some of our students and some of my coworkers. And like, I love the athleticism that's required, the camaraderie, the like having to work together, and that, like,
absolutely,
sports are awesome. But I think there is something to your point that is deeply problematic when I think, even for example, like when COVID happened and, sports got shut down for so long, like just how much people were like, I don't know what to do with myself. Like it was like time out, like no pun intended, but time out. Like this is maybe a big sign for us that if we take something away and no one knows how to respond other than to be either angry or like legitimately depressed or like hyper anxious. And I know like that was a weird time, so that's not to downplay it, but I think just that how we react to something changing is another, like maybe one of those factors. I think, like you said, on the individual level, the corporate level, I 100% agree of just like, I'm not saying this just because I'm an educator, but it kind of fits in there. We're going there. There's a point where like when I look at Steph Curry and I see how much money he's making, and I work in Milwaukee, and so I have kids who they will say, and they are not good at basketball. They will say, I'm so excited to make it to the NBA. And it's like, my guy, this is not being mean. This is just not what you should bank on. But that's because that's what our culture is built around, is like, oh, but if you do make it, you're going to make $75 million in a year playing this great, this amazing sport with all these people. Yeah. And like, this fun game on TV and Nike deals and all, but it's like, okay, but if our culture is valuing that and that's where all the money goes, well, guess what everyone's going to want to do? Or guess what everyone's going to invest their time in and their energy, versus if teachers were the most paid thing, or nurses were the most paid thing, or first responders like emergency or police or firefighters, or even if you got into other, if the workers who ran homeless care shelters, if those were the positions that were higher paid, the cynical part of me is like, I guarantee you there'd be a lot more shelters that would be opening up to help populations in need in different cities. So
I think that people will say, well, that's not just the way that economics work. And I'm like, but on an individual level it is. So if I know that I want to, let's just use one that's really personal. There are people who are asking Christians to give all the time for different missionaries, like monthly giving, whatever. Mm-hmm. And when the economy goes up and down, like that can impact a lot of things. Like that could be the first thing on the chopping block of like, man, I can't give that much. I literally can't give like, and promise to give you for an untold amount of years, $20 a month or $30 a month, $40 a month. But when you're saving up for a bigger purchase, like a stove or a TV or fixing a window or your roof, you can save the money is saved. It's what do you spend it on, right? I think the challenge is not, am I fixing my roof or am I like going to pay a missionary to spread the gospel. A lot of times the issues are with people who are like, I don't want to spend more money on healthcare for my grandmother or my mother or my father, but I really want to go to this Packers game, Bucks game, whatever. And that $500 is a once in a life opportunity. I'll never get that again. I got to do it. That's why the dollars, like the market goes that way. It's not the market goes that way, and that's a problem. The market goes what the market does. Not to be like full on laissez-faire, but the idea of, if I value my parents, I do not spend money on trips to Jamaica every year. I spend the money on visiting them. I spend the money on the things that help keep my kids and family and everybody else healthy. So that's how the market is changed, is where we have put it. And then the legal things and political things get into how those costs also change. So it's a much more complex, but on the individual level, we do have to look at that either or to ourselves.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll close out with this last question. And this is kind of dipping more specifically into like church Christian culture. And I'm hoping that this question will make sense. So I might clarify a little bit. But one of the reasons that the mega corporations want Jonathan out of the game is because he has essentially become bigger than Rollerball. So Rollerball is supposed to be this distraction, like you said earlier. It's just this thing to kind of like pacify people. But now it's been about Jonathan. It's about the player, and it's not about, what the game is doing. And so something that's interesting to me in evangelical culture is like we have had, especially in the last like 10 years, a lot of celebrity pastors who we could maybe swap out to be put in Jonathan's place, where all of a sudden, the system around church culture is built up to make these people these icons and to stand on these pedestals or to be in these high places. But then inevitably there becomes a point where it's like, yeah, but like you're not about the gospel anymore. Like it's just about your books or blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of the whole thing that put them there. So what do we do when evangelical culture has kind of like participated in turning hero pastors into villains? And like, what do you think it looks like? Do you think that's a trend? And do you think that's something that we need to be maybe more radical as a church in this idea of like systems and stuff like that and addressing?
I think, and I know I said this in a comment before, but like, I think this is a complex one because it's where are we putting ourselves in the situation? If we're the corporations, let's say, if evangelical congregants are the corporations, then we make the pastor. We don't get to tell the pastor what to do, and nobody really tells the pastors what to do after they rise. When the pastors fall of their own volition because they are not holy, perfect men, then we gang up on them and go, look at you, you blah, 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 blah. Nobody should ever listen to you again. And that is an issue, right? Of why do we prop you up? If you were to fall, we would tear you down. We should just stop propping people up. We should say, hey, this truth is good and that truth is good. Where did you hear that? It doesn't really matter where I heard it, but it was a pastor. Like, doesn't matter who their name is. There's all the economic reasons for why the pastor should get, credit for what they do, like in writing books. I think it's more in a individual church, a problem where someone is propped up and then villainized. If everybody pushes a pastor up to leadership and then sort of talks behind the pastor's back, that's a problem. So we have to be careful in those individual paces of like, are you now bad mouthing the person that you put in the position of leadership? On a evangelical culture scale, I think that we need to be careful about turning someone into a villain with our theology, knowing that everybody is truly a villain. So we should know that everybody has this capacity. So we shouldn't give somebody the power. If I was a corporation in the movie, to use that example and that analogy, if we're the corporations, we should already have had a retirement clause in the contract. You can only be a lead pastor for 7 years. After that, you must take a 7-year sabbatical or whatever, right? So you don't have 50 years or 70 years of in-office influence that could go to your head. Like, we could put those caps on ourselves, but that's the hard part. So let me know what you were thinking as you were thinking about the question a little bit more. Because I know we didn't get to talk too much before recording.
Sure. No, I think you hit it on the head. I think what was kind of running through my brain, and it might have gotten muddled in the question about essentially what I was thinking through is we'll get mad at someone who is a result of what we have forced them to become. So like, for example, Kanye West, like he's made his own choices. He's done his own things. He has his own issues. Totally get it. But there's also an obsessive culture that is unhealthily fascinated with his declines and his falls and his rises and his manic states and stuff like that. And so as a business person, there's part of me that I'm like, he's probably playing the game to an extent. And I don't say that lightly. It's more just if we've created systems where he profits or people like him, or in other scenarios, people profit from doing things that are not good for them. Or we create systems where little kids want to become NBA players and they don't want to become stem cell researchers because, stem cell research is probably a bad example. I was thinking stems, just like STEM. Stem cell.
Become STEM researchers.
Let me make that very clear. It's also, now it's 10 o'clock. Being part of like STEM and stuff like that. Yeah. They're not going to do that because we've not created an incentive to go there. And so I think for me, the thought is like, I just am interested in, the, not necessarily like Mars Hill, but who's the pastor I was thinking of that was with like Justin Bieber and
Carl Lentz.
Yeah, Carl Lentz. Like, I watched some of that documentary with Gloria, and like that really hit me because it was like he was kind of put into an oven that only makes pastors become what he became. But then he got villainized. Did he do things wrong? 100%. There's also some things that probably exacerbated the path and the access that he had to do some of those things through where he was. So that was kind of like the guts of the question.
We do like, again, that's why the movie has a singular character. We like noble rises. We like a Jonathan E. who's like, I rose over everything. And so we do put people in a position where they can rise over everything. And we jam them in that position really fast. There are people who I know who will get promotion after promotion after promotion, jump job. And so they really don't know from start to finish what it takes to build. Like, I don't think a pastor who is not counseled like every single life stage, right, should be put at like some national figurehead of the thing. I don't want to name pastors, but pastor wrote a prominent book, no longer claims to be a believer. But if you read his story or listen to his interviews, he was catapulted into that position from a very young age because he was articulate. Right. And so we can't look at people to go, oh, this person can say what I like. Let them be the savior. Let them do it all. Let's push them into power. Anybody who's voting based off of that. Just because a man or woman says the thing you like to hear does not mean they actually have all the skills and diplomatic resources and care and concern and understanding of policy pitfalls to do that. And so, I think that's, Carl Lentz, for those who are interested, he does have a few interviews where he's explaining about just the grace that he's found and how he doesn't want to get back into that cycle at all, ever. But just sort of like, it's a journey of a human being and not just this person who screwed up in one of the biggest ways you can. So
yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thanks for the good discussion. And so to close out, we're going to jump into our last section, theology. All right. So as Christians and as an organization, we at Parable Arrows think it is super important that we do not just take the messages and the things that we are absorbing from movies and just kind of assume that that is all true. We want something to filter all these ideas and these thoughts through and to rub them up against, and that for us is the scriptures. And so usually what we do to close out is to connect the couple Bible passages back to the film and maybe explain some of the ways that they're connected. So Femi, I think you had 2 verses, and then I'll close out with my 2, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. So in Acts 5, 12 to 41, it's a scene where the apostles are really growing in their influence, but they don't try to make this an established thing. They see, just like Jonathan E. did, like that they have provided value, and they don't try to build an establishment structure. They were under the structure of the Roman government, the Jewish leaders, and those structures allowed them to rise, to an extent, because of the way that they were managing and leading. The apostles' message was caught, and they provided value in that system. But what they did that was different from what a lot of people do today is they don't try to make themselves the new establishment heads. They didn't try to say, oh, therefore, let's kick these guys out and let us. They're like, no, we're just speaking the truth. And so they effectively navigated not focusing on their own growth and fame as individuals or as people, and taking a stand against the current establishment without trying to create a new order where they're on top. And I think that that's something that we should think about, where in the movie, it's not really clear what happens. But if Jonathan were to just say, trust me, I am your new leader, that would have been probably pretty bad. Saying, hey, everybody, we should all do this thing together. Like, don't worry about the corporations. Just stop purchasing everything they give us. Stop going to every single event, because that's the thing that's based on. Make some personal decisions. Not trying to make it about him. That would have been cool. And then Exodus 1, 8-10. This is where Pharaoh notices the threat to power, like the corporations notice the threat to power. And instead of forming an alliance and saying, hey, I want to work with the Israelites and the Jews because I see they're growing, and instead of trying to bash them down or use my power in a negative way, I want to figure out how I can make them successful, which is what God says to do through the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29, 4-7, and specifically verse 7. But out of the straight up oppression and ethnographic abuse, a lot of people take on populism today of listening to where the crowd is going and acting like you want to lead them there. The corporations want a system where they can maintain their comforts, but no one questions their position. Biblically, we seek the good of those who are rising. And so if you see somebody who's even against Christians rising to power, instead of trying to crush them, going like, wait, hold on. For the benefit of everyone, including you, how do we help you grow in goodness and virtue? And that might be counterintuitive than to just sort of squashing an anti-movement. But we see what happens here in this passage when that grows in Pharaoh's heart. So those are two things that were analogous to both A Better Way to Be a Jonathan and the downfall of being the corporations in the movie.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
Pass it to you.
No, those are great. So my first verse is actually kind of a pair, similar ideas, both in the New Testament. So 1 Peter 2, 11-25, and then Romans 13, 1. So these are the idea of submitting to higher authorities and using these scriptures to ask a really hard question of God, which is, when is it okay to quote unquote rebel? Because we do have instances in scripture where, for example, the Israelite women to Exodus, they didn't listen to Pharaoh. Like, they didn't kill all the male babies, and that's how we get Moses. And so that was an act of rebellion, but it was a very different act of rebellion than, like causing a riot and tearing down a king and dethroning the king and creating a new government in a city. Those are two different things. And so to me, these verses are open-ended, and I think are great invitation for us to actually seek God of like, what would this look like for me to honor you in being rebellious in a sense? And like, what's that nuance? And then the second verse I had was Romans 12:2. So this is, do not conform to the patterns of the world. And this kind of ties back to what I took away as one of the messages is, Jonathan has this moment in the movie where it seems like he almost wakes up and his eyes are open. He sees everything around him and he's like, oh, this is wrong. Like, this isn't how this should be. And so I think, I thought this was a small creative representation of what this idea of renewing your mind can look like practically. Because I think we think about, a lot of purity stuff and, not cursing and things like that. But I also think it's like, well, how do I actually literally see everything that I'm taking in the world around me? And how do I deal with that and filter that through how God would want me to see that? So
I was going to add one thing, because I feel just Spirit telling me to pray for people. So
yeah, let's do it.
The movie obviously has the quote of, no one individual is above the system or whatever. And Jonathan stands against that. But I know some people feel really stuck. And I just want to pray for anybody who's feeling stuck real quick. God, if anybody listening to this feels stuck or lost or like they're in a place where there's insurmountable odds against them. God, we want to pray for a non-worldly revolutionary hope. We want to pray for a divine hope that you can give them, that there is a purpose to their life, that there is meaning to their life and their involvement with those around them, that they can provide care outside of all the systems and physical structures they feel stuck by. God, I pray for healing for them. Pray for a feeling of peace. I pray that you remove the burden from them, and that they will realize that this is not a world we're living where it's just a rollerball system, but it's a system where we will hear the rolling thunder of the voice of God come through and break through the dawn, that will open our eyes and help us to see, and that they will have that hope to hold on to in a very, very broken world. I pray that in Jesus' name.
Amen. Awesome. Thanks, man. So again, this has been Parable Arrows. Thanks for listening. Again, please reach out if you have any questions, thoughts, and we are looking forward to sending you the next episode. Catch you in September.
Peace. This episode was produced by Josh Erickson, Josh Cook, and Femi Shokoya, and edited by Josh Erickson. Our social media producer is Colton Mefford. We are currently self-supported. You can check out short stories, merch, and highlighted creators at parablearrows.com. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Parable Arrows, or support us on Patreon. Thank you for listening to the Parable Arrows podcast. Think, move in faithfulness, and trust God. Pull back, aim high, let it fly.